There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their true weight concealed within the folds of the mundane. They are the casual remarks that echo for years, the accidental touches that reset your internal compass. You don't recognize them as turning points at the time. You only feel the ground shift beneath you, a subtle tectonic realignment that you will only understand in retrospect, when you look back from a future you could never have predicted and see the fine hairline crack where your old life ended and a new one began. For me, that crack appeared in the sterile quiet of our office, illuminated by the cold blue light of a computer monitor. He said it so casually, a phrase thrown away like a crumpled receipt. Liam was leaning against the frame of my cubicle, all restless energy and easy confidence, scrolling through flight details on his phone. We were finalizing the logistics for a week-long consulting trip to Portland, a project we'd been tethered to for months. He was the client-facing dynamo, the charismatic translator of complex data into palatable presentations. I was the quiet counterpart, the photographer and graphic designer tasked with making his brilliance visually coherent. We were a good team, an efficient partnership built on years of a friendship that had become the single most stable structure in my life. He looked up from his screen, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, and smiled that slightly lopsided smile that always seemed to disarm everyone but me. I was never disarmed. I was simply dismantled by it, piece by piece. "Hotel is booked," he announced, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Just one thing." I waited, my fingers paused over my keyboard. "Don't make this weird." The words hung in the air between us, small and strange and utterly out of place. I searched his face for a clue, a hint of the joke I was clearly missing. There was none. He was just watching me, his expression earnest, almost pleading. It was the kind of thing you say before a confession or before you ask an outrageous favor. It was a preemptive strike against an awkwardness that hadn't even occurred to me yet. My own mind, a frantic librarian, began thumbing through its vast catalog of our shared history, searching for a precedent for this kind of warning. It found nothing. Our friendship was the least weird thing I had. It was a quiet, comfortable room I had lived in for years, a space so familiar I no longer noticed the color of the walls. "Okay," I said slowly, the word feeling inadequate. "Why would I make it weird?" He just shrugged, the gesture too broad, too performative. "No reason. Just, it's a long trip. Lots of time together." He clapped me on the shoulder, a solid, reassuring contact that felt anything but. "Anyway, see you Monday." And then he was gone, a whirlwind of kinetic energy disappearing down the hall, leaving me in the silence with his strange, unsettling request echoing in the small space of my cubicle. "Don't make this weird." It felt like being warned not to think about a pink elephant. Suddenly, the elephant was the only thing in the room. And it wasn't until I received the automated confirmation email for our hotel, forwarded from his account, that I understood the size and shape of that elephant. The reservation was for a single room. One room, with one king bed. Liam and I had met 6 years prior, during a corporate onboarding session that felt like a special kind of beige-colored purgatory. He had arrived late, a flurry of apologies and wind-tousled hair, and had taken the only empty seat, which happened to be next to mine. While the presenter droned on about synergy and core competencies, Liam had leaned over and whispered, "If I fall asleep, do me a favor and draw a sophisticated-looking mustache on my face." I had stared at him, this stranger who radiated a warmth and an unfiltered charm that felt almost alien in the sterile corporate environment. I didn't know how to respond to that kind of effortless extroversion, so I just gave a small, noncommittal nod. But for the rest of the day, I was acutely aware of him beside me. The way he jiggled his knee, the smell of coffee and clean laundry, the sheer amount of space his presence seemed to occupy. He was a force of nature, a localized weather system of charisma and restless intelligence. I was, by comparison, a still pond, content in my quiet depths. Somehow, against all odds, we became friends. It was a friendship forged in the crucible of late-night project deadlines and fueled by terrible takeout food. Liam seemed to find my quietness calming, a port in the storm of his own energetic existence. He never pushed me to be more talkative, never seemed to mind the long stretches of silence that punctuated our conversations. He simply accepted my nature, making space for it alongside his own. For my part, I was endlessly fascinated by him. I, who spent my professional life capturing images, found him to be the most compelling subject I had ever encountered. My private folders were filled with photographs of him, candids taken over the years when he was not looking. Liam laughing so hard, he had to brace himself against a table. Liam staring out a window, his face etched with a thoughtfulness that the rest of the world rarely got to see. Liam asleep on my couch, his public-facing armor gone, looking younger and more vulnerable than anyone knew. I studied these images like a cartographer mapping an unknown continent, learning the topography of his moods, the subtle shifts in his expression that telegraphed stress or joy or a deep, hidden weariness. This quiet, intense observation was the shape of my love for him, a love I had walled off and insulated so carefully that I was certain it was undetectable. It was a secret garden I tended to in private, a place of profound beauty and profound loneliness. Our friendship was the most precious architecture in my life, and I would have sooner burned my own house down than risk its foundations. I was the keeper of the flame, and my primary duty was to ensure he never got burned. So I kept my distance, maintained the boundaries, and played my part as the steadfast, platonic friend. It was a role I had perfected, a performance so convincing that I sometimes even managed to fool myself. I told myself that the friendship was enough, that this proximity to his light was all I needed to feel warm. It was a beautiful, necessary lie. But the ground beneath us had already begun to shift, long before the booking of the hotel room. It had started 3 months earlier, with the end of his relationship with Sarah. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive breakup. It was worse. It was an erosion, a slow, quiet drifting apart that left him stranded on an island of his own confusion. He never spoke about her with anger, only with a kind of baffled sorrow, as if he'd been following a map that had suddenly dissolved in his hands. He couldn't understand how something that was supposed to be a landmark, a permanent fixture in the landscape of his life, could just vanish. The end of that relationship had hollowed something out in him, creating a space he didn't know how to fill. And so, he began to show up at my door. It started incrementally. A text on a Tuesday night. Got extra pizza. You in? Then a Thursday. My apartment is echoing. Mind if I crash on your couch and watch something mindless? Soon, it was a near-nightly occurrence. He would arrive, shed his workday persona like a heavy coat at the door, and collapse into the soft cushions of my sofa. He rarely talked about Sarah, or about the gnawing emptiness I could see behind his eyes. Instead, he would fill the space with chatter about work, about a stupid article he'd read, about anything and everything except the real reason he was there. He wasn't seeking advice or a therapy session. He was seeking quiet. He was seeking the specific kind of silence that my apartment and my presence seemed to offer. A silence that wasn't empty, but full of an unspoken understanding that he could simply be, without expectation, without performance. I became an unwitting sanctuary. My home, which had always been my fortress of solitude, was now a shared space, its emotional architecture subtly altered by his constant presence. The air grew thick with things unsaid. I would watch him from my armchair as he scrolled through his phone, his face illuminated in the dim light, and a dangerous current of hope would pull at me. I told myself I was just being a good friend. I told myself he was just grieving a loss and needed a safe harbor. But with every evening he spent there, with every shared pizza and quiet movie, the line between friendship and something more began to blur, dissolving like ink in water. His casual warning, "Don't make this weird," was not a warning to me. I saw that now, staring at the email confirmation for our single king bed. It was a warning he was giving to himself. He was the one walking toward a strange and unfamiliar shore, and he was terrified of the tide. The flight to Portland was a study in forced normalcy. We talked about the project, about the clients we were meeting, about the dreary, predictable weather forecast. Liam was relentlessly cheerful, a man performing the role of Liam on a business trip with unnerving precision. He kept the conversation firmly anchored in the shallow waters of professional obligation, never letting it drift toward the deep, dark shape I knew was waiting for us in that hotel room. I played my part, matching his professional tone, discussing presentation layouts and font choices as if my entire world hadn't been tilted on its axis by a single hotel reservation. Internally, I was a maelstrom of anxiety and a fragile, terrifying hope. Every casual brush of his arm against mine as he reached for his bag, every shared glance over the inanity of the in-flight magazine, was a spark on a field of dry tinder. I was hyper-aware of him, of the physical space between us, a space that felt both immense and infinitesimally small. The hotel itself was one of those boutique places that tried too hard to be cool, with exposed brick and Edison bulbs casting a self-consciously moody glow over everything. When the concierge handed Liam the keycard, a single, solitary keycard, he didn't flinch. He just thanked her, his voice even and steady, and led the way to the elevator. The silence as we ascended was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. It was filled with the weight of that king-sized bed, waiting for us on the 7th floor. I felt like a diver descending into the abyss, the pressure building with every passing floor, squeezing the air from my lungs. I focused on the mundane, on the slight tremor of the elevator car, on the bland, generic art on the walls, on anything other than the roaring in my own ears. When he swiped the card and pushed the door open, we both stopped on the threshold, as if we were trespassers. And there it was. It dominated the room, a vast expanse of white duvet and an arsenal of decorative pillows. It wasn't just a bed, it was a statement, an undeniable fact that could not be ignored or talked around. It was the physical manifestation of Liam's contradictory request. He had built this weird, uncomfortable, terrifyingly intimate space, and then had ordered me not to acknowledge it. He finally broke the silence, his voice a little too loud, a little too bright. Well, look at that. They must have overbooked the doubles. It was such a flimsy, transparent lie that it was almost insulting. He didn't even look at me as he said it, busying himself with setting his suitcase on the luggage rack, creating an immediate and artificial sense of purpose. That first night established the ritual that would define our week. After a long, stilted dinner with a client where we both drank a little too much wine, we returned to the room. The unspoken tension had coiled so tightly between us that I could practically feel it vibrating in the air. I went into the bathroom first, taking an absurdly long time to brush my teeth, staring at my own reflection and trying to coach myself into a state of calm. He's your friend. He's going through something. This is a mistake, an administrative error he's too embarrassed to fix. I repeated the phrases like a mantra, but the words felt hollow. When I emerged, he had already changed into a t-shirt and shorts and was standing by the bed, methodically taking the decorative pillows and building a neat, precise wall down the exact center of the mattress. It was a gesture both absurd and deeply, achingly poignant. A pillow fortress, a line of demarcation against the very intimacy he had engineered. "You can have this side," he said, gesturing to the half of the bed by the window. He still wasn't looking at me. He was focused on his task, aligning the pillows with the focus of a bomb disposal expert. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and went to my designated side. I slipped under the covers, my body rigid, my muscles tensed as if bracing for an impact. Liam turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow from the clock radio, and got into his side of the bed. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. I lay there, stock still, listening. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, the whisper of the air conditioner, and, most loudly of all, the sound of his breathing. It was slow and even, but it felt like a roar in the stillness. I was intensely aware of the warmth radiating from his body, a heat that seemed to seep across the no-man's land of pillows, a physical presence I could feel even without touching. I lay awake for hours that night, a sentinel guarding a border that felt both ridiculous and absolutely essential, my mind cataloging every rustle of the sheets, every slight shift of his weight, terrified of what it might mean, and even more terrified that it might mean nothing at all. The pillow wall lasted for 2 nights. On the third night, I woke in the pre-dawn grayness to find it dismantled. A single bolster pillow lay discarded on the floor, and the others had been pushed into a disorganized heap at the foot of the bed. In the space where the wall had been, his hand rested, palm up, just inches from my own. I stared at it, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was an invitation. It had to be. But the plausible deniability was still there, a perfect shield. He was a restless sleeper. He had kicked the pillows away in a dream. His hand was there by pure chance. I lay there, motionless, caught in a paralytic indecision. To move my own hand, to close that small gap and lace my fingers through his, felt like leaping off a cliff. To do nothing felt like a betrayal of this fragile, unspoken thing that was growing in the dark. I watched the first pale light of dawn creep into the room, tracing the shape of his hand, and I did nothing. The moment passed, and when he eventually stirred, he pulled his hand back without a word, as if it had never been there at all. The ritual evolved. The pretense of the pillow wall was abandoned, a silent treaty having been signed in our sleep. We simply went to our respective sides of the bed each night, the space between us a charged territory, a magnetic field of unspoken possibility. The days were a blur of work, meetings, presentations, forced professional smiles. Liam was brilliant, as always, commanding every room he entered. I would watch him, this confident, articulate man, and then I would think of the man who lay beside me in the dark, the one who sometimes, in what I had to assume was the deep grip of sleep, would shift closer, his arm brushing my back, his knee grazing my leg. These moments of accidental contact were electric, jolting me from my own light, restless sleep. I would lie perfectly still, barely breathing, trying to decipher the intent behind the touch. Was it a subconscious longing for comfort, a simple human need for warmth in the wake of his loneliness? Or was it something more? Was it a message sent from a part of him that was not yet brave enough to speak in the light of day? My mind became a courtroom where I was both prosecutor and defense, endlessly debating the evidence. The booking of the room was Exhibit A, a clear act of intent. His warning, "Don't make this weird," was the contradictory testimony. The dismantled pillow wall, the nocturnal migrations across the mattress, the fleeting touches in the dark, they were all circumstantial evidence, open to interpretation. I was drowning in ambiguity, starving for a single, undeniable fact. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and demand to know what he was doing, what any of this meant. But I was terrified that forcing the question would shatter the delicate, crystalline structure we were building. I was afraid that if I switched on the lights, the beautiful, mysterious creature that lived in the darkness between us would turn to dust. So I said nothing. I lay beside him night after night, my body a taut wire of yearning, and I waited. I waited for him to be brave enough for both of us. It happened on our last night in Portland. The project was a success. The clients were happy. We had celebrated with a final team dinner, and now the city was quiet around us, wrapped in a blanket of soft, persistent rain. The week of shared space, of constant proximity, had worn down our defenses. The tension had not disappeared, but it had transformed, ripening from something anxious and sharp into something heavy and expectant, like the air before a summer storm. We were lying in bed, the room dark except for the faint, geometric patterns of light cast on the ceiling from the streetlights below. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was different tonight. It wasn't a void, it was a presence. It held everything we had not said all week. Then his voice, quiet and tentative, cut through the darkness. "Julian." My heart seized. It was the first time all week he had spoken my name in this space, in this loaded quiet. "Yeah." My own voice was a rough whisper. A long pause followed, so long I thought maybe he had fallen asleep, that I had imagined it. The only sound was the rain tapping against the window pane, a gentle, rhythmic percussion. I could feel him shift, turning onto his side to face me. I could feel his gaze on me in the dark. "Can I ask you something stupid?" he finally said, his voice laced with a vulnerability I had never heard from him before. It was the voice of the boy in the photographs, the one the rest of the world never saw. A small, shaky laugh escaped me. Always. Another pause, the space between us crackling. He was gathering his courage, and I held my breath, giving him the time he needed to build the bridge. Would it? He faltered and started again. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The world stopped. The rain, the city, the air in my lungs, it all ceased to exist. There was only his question, hanging in the space between us. It was not a proposition. It was a plea. It was permission, sought and offered. All the ambiguity, all the internal debate, all the fear, it all collapsed under the weight of those few, honest words. He wasn't acting in his sleep. He wasn't making a mistake. He was here, now, awake and terrified and asking. In that moment, I saw the full scope of his gamble. He had placed our entire friendship on this one question, risking its irreplaceable architecture for the chance of building something new. And I realized my own risk was no smaller. There was only one possible answer. It was the answer I had been rehearsing in the silent theater of my mind for years. Yes. The word was barely audible, but it was enough. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a frightened animal. I felt the mattress dip with his weight, and then his hand was on my cheek, his thumb stroking my jawline. It was a touch of impossible tenderness, a confirmation and a question all at once. And then his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of quiet discovery, tentative and soft. It was the taste of rain and wine and a week of unspoken longing. It was a confession in the dark, a conversation we were finally having without words. In that gentle, hesitant contact, I felt the hairline crack that had formed in my life finally break wide open, not with a destructive shatter, but with the silent, decisive cleaving of a geode, revealing something beautiful and crystalline and utterly unexpected inside. The morning after was a descent into a new kind of silence. The easy intimacy of the kiss, the fragile truce we had declared in the dark, evaporated with the dawn. Liam woke before me and was already dressed when I opened my eyes, standing by the window with his back to me, staring out at the rain-slicked streets. The air in the room was thick with a heavy, anxious fog. The man who had so bravely asked to kiss me was gone, and in his place was a stranger, a man walled off behind a fortress of his own fear. He didn't speak. He just packed his suitcase with a tense, methodical efficiency, avoiding my gaze as if it were a physical blow. The silence was no longer expectant. It was accusatory. It was the sound of regret. The flight home was excruciating. He put on his headphones the moment we sat down, creating a deliberate and impenetrable barrier between us. He feigned sleep, his eyes closed, his body angled away from me. I sat there, staring at the back of the seat in front of me for 3 hours, feeling a cold, sick dread spread through my chest. Every scenario played out in my mind, each one more painful than the last. It had been a mistake, a moment of lonely, post-breakup confusion. He had used me for a fleeting comfort and was now horrified by what he'd done. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the dark of that hotel room had withered into a small, hard knot of humiliation. I had misinterpreted everything. I had built a cathedral of meaning out of a moment of weakness. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. He hadn't just broken the silence. He had broken me. That week back home was the longest of my life. The constant stream of texts, the easy drop-ins, the shared pizzas, it all stopped. My apartment felt cavernous, the silence he had once sought now a mocking echo of his absence. At work, he was a ghost. He found reasons to be in meetings on other floors, sent emails for things he would have once walked over to my desk to discuss. He was avoiding me with an almost frantic determination. The pain of it was a dull, constant ache. It was worse than the years of silent pining, because now I knew what I had lost. I had not just lost the possibility of something more. I was losing the friendship itself, the very foundation I had been so terrified of risking. It was crumbling into dust before my eyes. After 7 days of this agonizing radio silence, I knew I couldn't live in this limbo any longer. The not knowing was a poison. I would rather have the certainty of rejection than the slow death of this suffocating uncertainty. My fear of confrontation was immense, but it was finally eclipsed by my fear of losing him completely. That evening, I drove to his apartment. My hands were shaking as I walked up to his door. I could hear the faint sound of a television inside. I knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. The television went silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. I was about to turn and leave, to retreat back into my own misery, when the lock clicked and the door opened a few inches. He stood there, looking exhausted. The charismatic armor was gone. He just looked tired and sad. "Julian," he said, his voice flat. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice steadier than I expected. He hesitated for a second, then sighed and opened the door wider. His apartment was a mess, takeout containers stacked on the coffee table, clothes draped over a chair. It was the space of a man who was adrift. He didn't invite me to sit. He just stood in the middle of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "What happened, Liam?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. I wasn't there to accuse. I was there to understand. "In Portland." "What was that? And what is this?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a spot on the floor, his jaw tight. "I don't know. That's not good enough," I said, a new strength welling up inside me. I had been a passive observer for too long. You can't ask me a question like that, and then just disappear. You can't open that door and then slam it in my face. It was you. You booked the room. You broke down the pillow wall. You asked to kiss me. And now you're acting like I don't exist. I deserve to know why. A shudder went through him. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound and startling conflict. "I know," he whispered. "God, Julian, I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He sank onto the edge of his couch, burying his face in his hands. "I'm so messed up." I moved closer, sitting not beside him, but on the coffee table in front of him, forcing him to see me. "Talk to me." And he did. The words came out in a torrent, a confession of fear and confusion. He talked about Sarah, about how the end of their relationship had made him question everything he thought he knew about himself, about what he wanted. He admitted that his growing reliance on me, on my quiet, steady presence, had started to feel like something more than friendship a long time ago, but it had scared him. It was an unfamiliar territory, a map he didn't know how to read. He confessed that booking the single room was a subconscious test, a cowardly, reckless thing to do because he wanted to see what would happen, to force a situation he wasn't brave enough to create with his own words. "When I kissed you," he said, his voice cracking, "it was the first thing that's felt real and right in months. And that terrified me, because I don't know what it means. And I am so scared of messing this up, of ruining the one good, stable thing I have in my life. I'm so scared of hurting you." I listened to it all, the entire, messy, honest confession. The knot of humiliation in my chest began to loosen. He hadn't been regretting the kiss. He had been terrified of it. He wasn't running from me. He was running from the depth of a feeling he didn't understand and wasn't prepared for. When he was finished, I reached out and put my hand on his knee. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. "You think you're the only one who's scared," I said softly. "Liam, I have been in love with you for years. I have spent half a decade being terrified that you would find out and it would ruin everything. My entire life has been built around not making it weird, so believe me when I say I understand being afraid. But what you're doing now, this silence, this running away, that is what will ruin us. Not the kiss." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning realization, as if he were seeing the past 6 years from a completely new perspective. He was seeing the photographs I never showed him, the silences that were filled with things I never said. He was finally seeing me. "Years," he whispered, his voice full of wonder. I just nodded, a faint, sad smile on my lips. Years. That conversation in his messy living room became a new foundation. We didn't solve everything in that one night. There were no grand declarations, no promises of a perfect future. But we dismantled the fear, piece by piece, with honesty. We took the unspoken things that had lived between us for so long, my hidden love, his dawning realization, our mutual terror, and we laid them out in the open. We looked at them together, not as obstacles, but as the raw, authentic materials of whatever we were going to build next. The resolution wasn't an event, it was a process. It was a series of small, intentional choices. It was him texting me the next morning, a simple good morning. It was me inviting him over for dinner, and him showing up not as a refugee seeking sanctuary, but as a man coming home. A week later, he was on my couch again. But this time was different. There was no pretense of watching a movie, no buffer of takeout containers on the table. We just sat in the comfortable quiet, the kind of silence we had always shared, but it was imbued with a new meaning now. It was no longer the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things that no longer needed to be said. He turned to me, and there was no hesitation in his eyes, no fear. He just leaned in and kissed me, a kiss that was as gentle as the one in Portland, but filled with a quiet certainty that had not been there before. It wasn't a question anymore. It was an answer. We began to build our new life in the spaces between words. It was in the simple act of him leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a silent declaration of permanence. It was in the way we now slept, not on opposite sides of a vast mattress, but tangled together, seeking each other's warmth without thought or pretext. The architecture of my life had been irrevocably altered. The quiet, solitary rooms of my past had been opened up, their walls knocked down to create a new, shared space. The fortress I had so carefully constructed to protect my heart had become our home. You learn that the most profound changes in your life are often not loud declarations, but quiet recognitions. They are not about finding something new, but about finally having the courage to name what has been there all along. The journey wasn't about a business trip or a hotel room with a single bed. It was about closing the door on fear and plausible deniability, and learning to trust the truth that had been living in the quiet rooms of our hearts. We had finally stopped making it weird, and in doing so, we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.